Welcome to True Crime Stories for English Learners, where real-life mysteries meet clear and simple English.
America's first female serial killer, Aileen Wuornos. The body was found on December 13, 1989, in the woods along I-75 in Florida. The victim was a 51-year-old man named Richard Mallory. He had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol. His car was missing. At first, police treated it as a robbery gone wrong, perhaps a carjacking. They had no idea this was the beginning of a serial killing spree that would shock America. Over the next year, 6 more bodies would be found along Florida's highways. All were middle-aged men. All had been shot with the same gun. All had been killed by the same person. And that person was not who anyone expected. She was a woman. A prostitute who worked the highways, hitchhiking and offering sex to men who picked her up. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and she would become known as America's first female serial killer. But her story is more complicated than that simple label suggests. It's a story of abuse, survival, violence, and a life that went terribly wrong from the very beginning. A childhood of horror. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. She was born into circumstances that would have destroyed most people. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a psychopathic child molester who was in prison at the time of her birth. He would later hang himself in prison in 1969. Aileen never met him. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was just 15 years old when Aileen was born. She already had one child, Aileen's older brother, Keith. Diane was completely unprepared for motherhood and overwhelmed by the responsibility of 2 young children. When Aileen was 4 years old, Diane abandoned both children, leaving them with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. Lori and Britta legally adopted Aileen and Keith, but they never told the children they were adopted. Aileen grew up believing her grandparents were her parents, and that her mother was her older sister. She wouldn't learn the truth until she was 12 years old. This deception would be just one of many betrayals in her young life. Life with her grandparents was brutal. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic with a violent temper. He beat Aileen regularly, often using a belt or a strap. The abuse was severe and frequent. Aileen lived in constant fear of her grandfather's rage. There was no safety, no comfort, no sense that she was loved or valued. But the abuse was even worse than the beatings. Aileen later claimed that her grandfather sexually abused her, though this has never been definitively proven. What is certain is that someone was sexually abusing her during her childhood. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen was engaging in sexual activities with boys in her neighborhood in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food. At age 14, Aileen became pregnant. The father was reportedly a friend of her grandfather who had raped her, though some sources claim it was a boy from her neighborhood. Either way, the pregnancy was the result of abuse. In March 1971, Aileen gave birth to a baby boy. The child was immediately put up for adoption. Aileen never saw him again. Shortly after giving birth, Aileen's grandmother Britta died of liver failure, likely related to alcoholism. Her grandfather Lori became even more violent and unpredictable. The home was no longer just abusive, it was uninhabitable. In 1971, when Aileen was 15 years old, her grandfather kicked her out of the house. She was homeless, living in the woods near her school, surviving by prostitution. Think about that for a moment. Aileen was 15 years old. She had been beaten and sexually abused for years. She had just given birth and given up a baby. Her grandmother had died, and now she was living in the woods, selling her body to survive. She had received almost no education, had no job skills, had no family support, and had learned that her value to men was purely sexual. This was the foundation on which the rest of her life would be built. In 1976, when Aileen was 20 years old, both her brother Keith and her grandfather Laurie died. Keith died of throat cancer at just 21 years old. Laurie committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. Aileen inherited $10,000 from Keith's life insurance policy, but she spent the money within months on a car that broke down and on various attempts to start a new life that all failed. Life on the road through her 20s, Aileen lived a chaotic, nomadic existence. She hitchhiked around the country, working as a prostitute, getting into trouble with the law repeatedly. She was arrested for drunk driving, disorderly conduct, assault, and writing bad checks. She served short jail sentences, but never long enough to receive any real help or rehabilitation. Aileen also attempted to have normal relationships several times, but they always ended badly. In 1976, she married a 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Fell. The marriage lasted less than 2 months. Louis filed for divorce after Aileen beat him with his own cane during an argument. The pattern was clear. Aileen had learned violence as a response to conflict, and she struggled to maintain any stable relationship. By the mid-1980s, Aileen had settled in Florida, working as a prostitute along the highways. She would hitchhike, offering rides and sex to men who picked her up. It was dangerous work. Prostitutes, especially those working on the streets and highways, are extremely vulnerable to violence. Many men who pick up prostitutes see them as less than human, as objects they can abuse without consequence. Aileen experienced this violence repeatedly. She was beaten, raped, and robbed by clients. She had learned early in life that the world was a dangerous place where people hurt you, and now her work put her in contact with some of the most dangerous men. She carried weapons for protection, usually a gun, and she developed a deep hatred for men, seeing them all as potential threats or abusers. In 1986, Aileen met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. Tyria, or Ty as she was called, was 24 years old, 8 years younger than Aileen. They quickly fell in love and began a relationship. For Aileen, this was the first time in her life she felt truly loved and accepted. Tyria became the most important person in her world. Aileen would do anything for Ty, including continuing her dangerous work as a prostitute to support them both financially. But the relationship was complicated. Tyria knew what Aileen did for money, but didn't work herself. Aileen supported them both through prostitution, which meant putting herself at risk night after night. And as Aileen's anger and trauma accumulated, as she experienced more violence from clients, something inside her was building toward an explosion. The first murder on November 30th, 1989, Aileen was hitchhiking along Interstate 75 in Florida. A man named Richard Mallory picked her up. Mallory was 51 years old, owned an electronics repair shop, and had a history of violent behavior toward women, including a previous conviction for rape, though Aileen may not have known this at the time. According to Aileen's later testimony, Mallory picked her up, they agreed on a price for sex, and they drove to a wooded area. But once there, Aileen said, Mallory became violent. He raped her, sodomized her, and tortured her. Fearing for her life, Aileen pulled out her .22 caliber pistol and shot him. She shot him multiple times, killing him. Then she took his money, his car, and left his body in the woods. Aileen drove Mallory's car back to the apartment she shared with Tyria. She told Ty what had happened, saying she had to kill a man in self-defense. Tyria helped Aileen clean the car and get rid of evidence. They abandoned the car and tried to return to their normal life. But something had changed in Aileen. She had killed a man and taken his possessions. She had gotten away with it, and she had discovered that killing a man and taking his belongings was easier and more profitable than prostitution. Whether the killing was truly self-defense, or whether Mallory's violence triggered something in Aileen that made her decide to start killing, we'll never know for certain. But either way, Richard Mallory's death was not the end. It was the beginning. 6 more bodies over the next year. Aileen killed 6 more men. The pattern was similar each time. She would hitchhike along Florida's highways. A man would pick her up. They would agree on a price for sex. They would drive to a remote area. And then Aileen would shoot them, take their money and possessions, and leave their bodies in the woods. The victims were David Spears, 43, found June 1st, 1990, Charles Carskadden, 40, found June 6th, 1990, Troy Beerus, 50, found August 4th, 1990, Charles Dick Humphreys, 56, found September 12th, 1990, Walter Geno, Antonio, 62, found November 19th, 1990. Some of these men had families who loved them. They had jobs, homes, normal lives. They made the mistake of picking up a hitchhiker who had decided that men were the enemy, that they all deserved to die, and that killing them was easier than surviving any other way. Aileen later claimed that several of these men had been violent with her, that she killed in self-defense each time. But the evidence didn't support this. The men were shot multiple times, often in the back as they tried to run away. Items were stolen from each victim. The killings appeared to be robberies, not defensive actions. Tyria Moore knew what was happening. Aileen came home repeatedly with cars that belonged to the victims, with their possessions, with money. Ty didn't report it to police. She continued living with Aileen, continued benefiting from the stolen money and items. Later, Ty would claim she was afraid of Aileen, that she didn't know what to do. But for a year, she said nothing while Aileen continued killing. The police began to connect the murders. Multiple bodies, all male, all shot with the same gun, all found near highways in Central Florida. They realized they had a serial killer, but they didn't know who or why. The pattern didn't fit what they expected. Most serial killers are men. Most target women, but these victims were all middle-aged men, and the killer was taking their cars and possessions, suggesting robbery as a motive. Witnesses started coming forward. People had seen 2 women in several of the victims' cars. Composite sketches were created. The police released the sketches to the media, asking for help identifying the women. Within days, people who knew Aileen and Tyria recognized them. Tips flooded in. The police now knew who they were looking for. The capture in January 1991. Police tracked down Tyria Moore, who had left Florida and gone to Pennsylvania to stay with family. They confronted her with evidence and told her she would be charged as an accessory to murder unless she cooperated. Faced with prison time, Tyria agreed to help police catch Aileen. The police set up a sting operation. They had Tyria call Aileen and tell her that police were asking questions about her. Tyria said she was scared and thought police might suspect them. The calls were recorded. During these conversations, Aileen said things that sounded like admissions of guilt. She told Tyria not to worry, that she would take all the blame, that she loved Ty and would protect her. The calls gave police enough to arrest Aileen. On January 9th, 1991, She was arrested at a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, on an outstanding warrant. Once in custody, police interrogated her about the murders. At first, Aileen denied everything. But after several hours, and after being told that Tyria was in trouble too, Aileen confessed. She admitted killing 7 men. She claimed each killing was self-defense, that every single man had been violent with her, had raped her, or tried to rape her, and that she killed them to survive. She said she was a victim, not a criminal, that she had spent her entire life being abused by men, and had finally fought back. But the evidence told a different story. The victims had been shot multiple times, often in the back. Their possessions had been stolen. Aileen had sold their belongings at pawn shops. She had used their credit cards. This didn't look like self-defense. It looked like robbery and murder. Aileen also said that Tyria had nothing to do with the murders, that Ty didn't know what was happening, that she wanted to protect Ty from any consequences. This was clearly a lie. Tyria had been with her, had helped dispose of evidence, had lived off the stolen money, but Aileen loved Ty and wanted to protect her, even now, even after Ty had betrayed her to police. The trial Aileen Wuornos was charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. The courtroom was packed with media and spectators. America was fascinated by the case. A female serial killer was extremely rare. The media called her a monster, a man-hater, and America's first female serial killer. Though this wasn't technically accurate, there had been female serial killers before. Aileen's defense was self-defense. Her lawyers argued that she had killed Richard Mallory to protect herself from rape and murder. They presented evidence of Mallory's prior rape conviction, suggesting he was a violent man who had attacked Aileen. They argued that a woman working as a prostitute had a right to defend herself against violent clients. But the prosecution argued that Aileen was a cold-blooded killer who murdered men for their money and possessions. They presented evidence of the multiple gunshots, the stolen items, and Aileen's use of the victim's credit cards and cars. They argued that, if this was self-defense, why did she shoot them in the back? Why did she rob them? Why did she continue killing 6 more men? The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death. Aileen would face 5 more trials for the other murders, and each time she was convicted and sentenced to death. During the trials and sentencing hearings, Aileen's behavior was erratic and confrontational. She cursed at the judge. She yelled at the prosecution. She seemed unable to control her anger or present herself sympathetically. Some people wondered if she was mentally ill, if years of trauma and abuse had damaged her mind. But the courts found her competent to stand trial and be executed. Tyria Moore testified against Aileen in exchange for immunity. She was never charged with any crime. On the stand, Ty described her relationship with Aileen and admitted she had known about at least some of the murders. But she claimed she was afraid of Aileen and didn't know what to do. Aileen watched Ty testify, the woman she loved betraying her to save herself. Whatever hope Aileen might have had for understanding or sympathy died in that moment. Death Row Aileen spent over 10 years on death row at the Florida Correctional Institution. During this time, her story became more widely known. A documentary filmmaker named Nick Broomfield made 2 films about her case. The film showed interviews with Aileen, with Tyria, with police, and with Aileen's lawyers. They raised questions about whether Aileen had received a fair trial, whether her claims of self-defense should have been taken more seriously, and whether executing her was justice or just more violence against an already damaged person. Aileen also gave numerous interviews from prison. In some, she maintained her story of self-defense. In others, she admitted the killings were intentional and said she would do it again. Her statements were inconsistent and contradictory, making it difficult to know what was true. Some experts who examined her believe she had borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Others thought she showed signs of psychosis and paranoia. In the final years of her life, Aileen seemed to give up. She fired her lawyers who were appealing her death sentence. She said she wanted to die, that she was ready for execution. She claimed the prison was torturing her, that correctional officers were putting something in her food, that people were controlling her mind through sound waves. These paranoid delusions suggested serious mental illness, but the courts determined she was competent to make the decision to stop her appeals. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." The statement was confused and bizarre, suggesting someone who was mentally unwell. Aileen was 46 years old when she died. She had spent 13 years on death row. Her ashes were scattered in her home state of Michigan by her childhood friend Dawn Botkins, one of the few people who had stayed in touch with her and shown her any kindness. Was justice served? The case of Aileen Wuornos raises difficult questions about justice, abuse, and violence. Was Aileen a cold-blooded serial killer who deserved execution? Or was she a damaged victim of lifelong abuse who finally fought back against her attackers? The truth is probably somewhere in between, and that complexity makes her case so troubling. There's no doubt that Aileen killed 7 men. The evidence is overwhelming. She confessed, and the forensics supported her guilt. These men died because of her actions, and their families suffered terrible losses. Whatever Aileen's motivations or mental state, these deaths were real tragedies that destroyed multiple families. But it's also true that Aileen suffered horrific abuse throughout her life. She was beaten, sexually abused, abandoned, and traumatized from her earliest childhood. She was raped, assaulted by clients, and lived in constant danger. The first victim, Richard Mallory, did have a history of violence against women. It's possible, even likely, that he was violent with Aileen. The question is whether her response was self-defense or murder. Some feminists and activists argued that the criminal justice system treated Aileen more harshly because she was a woman. They pointed out that male serial killers often don't receive death sentences as quickly. They argued that society is more willing to execute a woman who kills men than a man who kills women. They said that Aileen's profession as a prostitute biased the jury against her, making them less sympathetic to her claims of self-defense. Others argued that Aileen received special treatment because she was a woman, that if a man had killed 7 people in the same circumstances, no one would question the death sentence. They said that her abuse didn't excuse her crimes, that plenty of people suffer abuse without becoming serial killers. They pointed out that she continued killing for a year, which goes beyond self-defense and into predatory behavior. The question of whether Aileen was mentally ill enough that she shouldn't have been executed is also controversial. She clearly had serious psychological problems. Her behavior was erratic and paranoid. She showed signs of delusions, but the legal standard for mental competence is low. You just need to understand that you're being executed, and why. Aileen met that standard even though she was clearly deeply disturbed. There's also the question of Tyria Moore's role. Ty knew about the murders. She benefited from the stolen money and possessions. She helped Aileen dispose of evidence, yet she was never charged with any crime. She cooperated with police and testified against Aileen in exchange for immunity. Some people see this as justice. Ty was a victim of Aileen's crimes too, scared and manipulated. Others see it as hypocrisy. Ty was an accomplice who escaped punishment by betraying her lover. The broader picture, the story of Aileen Wuornos, is ultimately a story about the failure of multiple systems to help a vulnerable child. Aileen should have been protected. When her mother abandoned her, when her grandfather abused her, when she became pregnant at 14, when she was homeless at 15, at any of these points, intervention could have changed the trajectory of her life. But no one helped. No teacher noticed the signs of abuse. No social worker intervened. No one provided support or resources. Aileen fell through every crack in the system and ended up on the streets where the only way she knew to survive was to sell her body. This doesn't excuse her crimes, but it explains how someone ends up in a position where killing feels like the only option. Aileen's story also highlights the extreme vulnerability of sex workers, particularly those who work on the streets or highways. These women are at high risk of violence. They are raped, beaten, and killed by clients at alarming rates. Many people don't care when prostitutes are victimized because society sees them as criminals or as somehow deserving of violence. This attitude creates an environment where violent men can target these women with little fear of consequences. The fact that Aileen claimed self-defense raises the question, how should a prostitute defend herself against a violent client? If a man picks up a prostitute and becomes violent, does she have the right to use lethal force to protect herself? Most would say yes. Everyone has the right to self-defense. But Aileen's case suggests that juries are skeptical of these claims when the woman is a prostitute and the victim is a respectable man. Finally, Aileen's case is a reminder that women can be violent too. The vast majority of serial killers are men. The vast majority of violent criminals are men, but women are capable of violence. And sometimes women kill. Society is often more shocked when women commit violent crimes because it violates our expectations of women as nurturing and non-violent. But women are human beings with the same capacity for rage, desperation, and violence as men. The cultural impact. Aileen Wuornos became a cultural figure, appearing in documentaries, books, and films. The most famous is the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron as Aileen. Theron won an Academy Award for her portrayal, transforming herself physically and emotionally to capture Aileen's rage, pain, and humanity. The film was praised for showing Aileen as a complex person rather than simply a monster. The film also depicted Aileen's relationship with Tyria Moore and showed how Aileen's love for Ty motivated some of her actions. The movie raised sympathy for Aileen, showing her abuse and suffering while not excusing her crimes. It humanized her in a way that news reports hadn't, but some critics argued that the film and other media glorified Aileen or made her into an anti-hero. They worried that portraying her sympathetically might inspire others or minimize the suffering of her victims. There's always a tension in true crime media between telling a full story and potentially glorifying criminals. Aileen's story has also been used in debates about the death penalty. Supporters of execution point to her case as an example of why capital punishment is necessary. She was a dangerous killer who would kill again if given the chance. Opponents use her case to argue that the death penalty is applied unfairly, that her mental illness should have precluded execution, and that society failed her long before she failed society. Lessons and reflections. What can we learn from the story of Aileen Wuornos? Several lessons emerge from this tragic case. First, childhood abuse has lasting consequences. Aileen's horrific childhood shaped everything that came after. The violence she experienced taught her that violence was normal, that the world was dangerous, that people would hurt her. This doesn't excuse her crimes, but it helps explain them. If we want to prevent future Aileen Wuornoses, we need to protect children from abuse and provide support for those who have been traumatized. Second, vulnerable populations need protection. Sex workers, homeless people, addicts. These groups face violence at alarming rates, and society often doesn't care. If we valued these lives more, if we provided support and alternatives, if we prosecuted crimes against these populations as seriously as we prosecute other crimes, we could prevent both their victimization and reduce the circumstances that lead some to commit crimes themselves. Third, the justice system struggles with complexity. Aileen's case wasn't simple. It involved self-defense claims, mental illness questions, and debates about fairness. The system tends to prefer clear-cut cases where guilt is obvious. When cases are complicated, when the perpetrator is also a victim, the system often fails to deliver truly just outcomes. Fourth, revenge and violence create cycles that are hard to break. Aileen experienced violence and responded with violence. Society responded to her violence with more violence. Execution. At each step, violence was met with more violence. Breaking these cycles requires different approaches: prevention, rehabilitation, addressing root causes rather than just punishing symptoms. Finally, we need to be careful about how we tell these stories. True crime is popular entertainment, but these are real people who suffered and died. The victims deserve to be remembered with dignity. The perpetrators deserve to be understood as complex human beings, not simplified into monsters or heroes. The goal should be learning, not just entertainment. The victims remembered. In telling Aileen's story, we must also remember her victims. 7 men died, and their families suffered losses that can never be repaired. Richard Mallory was 51, owned a business, and had people who cared about him. Whatever violence he may have committed in his past, he didn't deserve to be shot and left in the woods. David Spears was 43, a construction worker. Charles Carskadden was 40, working various jobs to survive. Troy Burris was 50, a sausage salesman with family. Charles Humphreys was 56, a retired Air Force major and police chief. Walter Antonio was 62, a truck driver and reserve police officer. These men were fathers, brothers, sons. They had families who loved them. Their deaths left holes in people's lives that will never be filled. Whatever their flaws, whatever mistakes they made in picking up a hitchhiker, they didn't deserve murder. It's easy, when telling Aileen's story, to focus on her abuse and suffering and forget that she created new victims, new suffering. These men's families also deserve justice and remembrance. Final thoughts. Aileen Wuornos was executed nearly 20 years ago, but her case continues to fascinate and disturb us. She was neither a simple monster nor a simple victim. She was both and neither. A complicated human being shaped by terrible circumstances who made terrible choices. Her life was one of almost unimaginable suffering from the very beginning. The abuse she endured would have broken most people. That she survived as long as she did, in some ways, shows remarkable resilience. But survival came at a terrible cost. To her mental health, to her humanity, and ultimately to the lives of 7 men who crossed her path. Was justice served when Aileen was executed? That depends on what you believe justice means. If justice is punishment for crimes committed, then yes, she killed 7 people and paid with her life. If justice means addressing the root causes of crime and rehabilitating offenders, then no, Aileen was failed by every system that should have helped her, and executing her just added one more violence to an already violent story. What's clear is that Aileen Wuornos' life didn't have to end this way. If she had been protected as a child, if she had received help instead of abuse, if society provided better support for its most vulnerable members, the trajectory of her life might have been completely different. 7 men might still be alive. Aileen herself might have had a chance at something resembling a normal life. Instead, we have a tragedy. Multiple tragedies, really. The tragedy of Aileen's destroyed childhood. The tragedy of 7 men murdered. The tragedy of families devastated by loss. The tragedy of a system that failed at every step to prevent any of this from happening. Aileen Wuornos called herself the world's biggest prostitute-hating bitch in one of her final statements. But that's not who she was at the core. At the core, she was a child who was never loved, never protected, never given a chance. That child grew into a damaged adult who did terrible things, and the state executed her, closing the final chapter on a life that was suffering from the very beginning. Whether that was justice or just more violence in a violent story, each person must decide for themselves. But what's undeniable is that this case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about crime, punishment, victimization, and what we owe to each other as members of society. Aileen Wuornos' story is a mirror that reflects back some of society's deepest failures. And until we address those failures, there will be more stories like hers. Not exactly the same, but similar in their tragedy and waste.
Another dark chapter closed, but the mystery of human nature continues. Thanks for listening to True Crime Stories for English Learners. Don't forget to subscribe and join me next time for another real story that's stranger than fiction.